record right here. Hey, look at that. I did it. All right. So with that, let me bring up this presentation. Oh, I always do that. Hold on. And share screen. There we go. All right. All right, good. Well, here are just a few slides to sort of capture an overview of our work and to let you know where things stand and what we think our next steps are. We've been pushing towards a final report to present to you and to whomever else you think this report ought to go. I had a dry run with this presentation at the missioners meeting last week just to get their input on these things. And so that was very helpful. Okay, so as you know, you'll know a lot of this background, Bishop Kim, but it's just good to kind of get it out in front of us. That we drew from or started from looking at Wendy Huber and others' work from 18, 19, and 20, which really did a detailed look at how things work in the diocese and focused a lot on LPLs and partnership vicars, partnerships, and so forth. And from my estimation, I kind of looked at that as sort of a structural and systemic sort of view of what's going on in small and rural churches. So then the task force was formed earlier this year. And by and large, the members of our task force were from small and rural churches. And so the approach we took was much more a grassroots sort of ground up view of what was going on. So maybe the two of these two reports in some way kind of go together, but some of the information from Wendy and others' report is a bit outdated now, and we've tried to update that with our direct contact with a lot of folks in these churches. So here, just to remind you, here's the group of people that were on the task force. As you can see, most of them are in small and rural churches. And that was great. That was really helpful because there was a real sense that, you know, we need to dig into this and see what's working, see how folks feel. Okay. So right off the bat, we had a few challenges. One, which was the concept of rural is difficult to define. Even the Census Bureau doesn't have a very clear definition of what rural means. But in the course of our work, we did find a couple of small congregations that we didn't think they were small for sure, but they weren't exactly rural. They weren't some distance from another Episcopal church or out, out on the prairies or out on the western slope. So we sort of included some of their information, but we didn't focus on them perhaps as much. It was our hope, of course, that we would come up with an end product that would have some impact, to not just be a paper report on some shelf somewhere. And that our work really would reflect some of the unique circumstances and stories of these churches. And if I took away one thing from the missioners meeting was that they too feel like some of these stories are inspiring and worth holding out there for people to examine. And I guess we'll touch on a couple of those today. So we had 3 areas of interest. We kind of broke ourselves up into 3 areas, following on the bullet points that you had initially laid out for us for the task force. One was to focus on lay pastoral leaders and their needs, their interests, etc. And the second one was looking at clergy utilization, looking at all the different ways in which clergy are involved in small and rural churches, both priests and deacons, of course. And then dealing with more of the qualitative issues around small and rural congregations, basically what it means to be a thriving congregation. I think that was captured in one of the initial bullet points in our charge, was to look at how churches might thrive into the future. So that was something we wanted to grab a hold of and see if we could lay out some of those characteristics. So each group conducted research or did interviews, collected data, And as a result, each subgroup has developed a set of recommendations, which we're still sort of fine tuning and making sure we all agree on the recommendations that we want to put forward. So the LPL area, our two members of our task force went and talked to a whole bunch of LPLs and asked for their input. And Lucy has been such an important addition to our task force. She has really been working hard to try to clear up some of these issues that could be resolved with just figuring out, well, what's the system for doing these things? And so some of this, is a little bit out of step with what Lucy has done so far. But that regularizing the process for training and relicensing and licensing LPLs is obviously something which our LPLs were confused about. What was happening? How do I do this? And, does the diocese want to have me as an LPL? So trying to reassure them of that, but find out what their curiosity was, I guess, our concerns. Clarifying who has responsibility for supporting LPLs. Whose area does this fall into? Is this under the canon for administration? Is this under Vanessa's area? That was something that we wanted to clarify, based, of course, on their needs, the things they were expressing. We've yet to kind of finalize or determine norms for supervision and accountability of LPLs. Like all of us in the church and in society generally, but in the church, we all are accountable to someone, some group, and so forth, as are the LPLs. Some ideas about continuous recruitment. We have a number of LPLs that are getting up there. Doug not included. Doug is not one of the aging people.
Is Doug a youngster in the group?
Not really.
But that we need to figure out how are we going to continue to recruit people to do this and to how do we go about introducing the LPL concept in churches that could use them, maybe don't know how that works or what it would mean for them and so forth. Second area, clergy utilization. Kay, Piper, and I jumped into this area, tried to identify all the different ways that clergy are being utilized at present. We have part-time, we have full-time, we have supply only. I mean, you know how this all comes down, but just kind of lay that out to show all the different ways in which these small churches are utilizing the clergy they can get their hands on. The important need for support and guidance for partnership vicars as they encounter challenges or difficulties. Who are they supposed to work with or turn to? That was a question. The impact of clergy retirement and respite and resignation. Often these clergy just aren't aware that anything could happen after they leave, that they feel like when they retire, that's going to be the end of the line for that particular congregation. So the importance of working with them and so forth to try to provide some succession planning or a change in approach. Perhaps the next step for some of these congregations might be LPLs under a partnership vicar or under a vicar. Supply clergy, Vanessa's really been pounding the pavement on this one and trying to figure out where supply clergy are and when they can serve churches that are in remote areas. Some of our small churches have a better system than others. They're a little bit more fortunate to have a stronger support group of supply clergy. But they're by and large concentrated on the Front Range. So, when somebody like Meeker or Craig, if they need a day off from services, do they have an option with supply clergy or should they be looking in another direction? Increased utilization of deacons. I know from Kay Piper's comments and also from Roberts, who was at the deacons meeting, that this is under discussion about how deacons might be more utilized in congregations, small and rural congregations. And of course, really trying to hold up and encourage ecumenical and interfaith potential. A lot of our churches right now are interfaith by their very nature, ecumenical by their nature. So like Craig, which is a blended congregation, Lutheran Episcopal and so forth, and Buena Vista. being Methodist and Episcopal. So the third area, I'm going to let Doug talk about.
Okay. Bishop, when you announced the desire to have this task force, letter I got, one word jumped off the page at me, and it was thriving. Consequently, me and one other member of the task force, eventually appointed, decided to look it up in the dictionary. And we found, I think, 6 or 7 different definitions. But oddly enough, Wikipedia said that each definition had one thing in common, and that was the idea of feeling good about yourself. And I don't think that happens enough in small churches, because there's a lot of things undermining that could undermine feeling good about the situation in the church. So I was delighted that someone else was interested in that too. And so we looked at some of the literature that was offered to us and found something that was, I think, really relevant in the characterization of small rural churches. And that was a work by Samuel Wiley. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's posted in our website, and it's probably 30 years old, but I think it still holds very true. And then a thing that I ran across was a book by Jeffrey McDonald, which says, it's titled "Part-Time is Plenty." And I think that's relevant to the trend that goes on. And I think he had a lot to say about how churches can deal with the lack of clergy presence and operate quite effectively. A couple of the concepts that came out big time were an attitude or a lack of dependence on clergy to do everything there was to do, and needs for adjustment in that, and accordingly building up the laity in every way possible. Empowering them might be one word, but feeling confident in possible personal ministry was another. So we looked at I think we ended up with 11 different small churches, and came up with some narrative about them, which we can share in our report. And all but one of them was thriving by our notions of what thriving was. Besides non-dependence on clergy, an outward focus was just about the biggest one. Not thinking about how terrible the situation was with losing people and all that, but instead, looking at what the community needed and actually considering the church a community, a resource of the community, not so much the building belonging to the congregants, but the building there is an asset for the whole community, and how to take advantage of that. So there are a number of examples of stories that will be in our report, but one of them really stood out to me. It's kind of an archetype of what a small church can be with a handful or two of people in the congregation. And so the example that I'd like to go over with you, or at least tell you about, was St. George in Leadville. They still, I think the congregation still is just a couple of handfuls of people, but their story is a resurrection story, really, because that church was once closed by the diocese. And I found out the story of its reopening from my interview. And I was told that after the church had closed, there was a person that moved to Leadville from another part of the country and was looking to transfer to St. George's. Well, it wasn't quite possible to do when it was closed. And that person met with a former congregant, and they got talking about the terrible food insecurity in Leadville. It just so happened that this person had taken on food insecurity in their previous home congregation and knew a lot about it and how to address it. And the two people persuaded the diocese to reopen the church or a venue for outreach. And they sent a deacon to help things out. And during the time since that happened, which is, I believe, the 90s, mid-90s, that ministry still exists, and the people thrive because of it. Not only the people in the church, but the community. They have leveraged support from community organizations and with grants, government grants, even the national, I don't know if this is the national, regional, or local historic preservation society, and got improvements to their kitchen and facilities from that source. So they went through periods with and without clergymen or clergy people. COVID came along. They had a couple serving as priests that helped them for a while, but they left before COVID. And when COVID hit, the demand and need for food increased by about 20-fold. They managed to serve it. Even though they started with a hot plate in a little room the size of a closet, delivering or serving meals, they went on to have a mobile neighborhood delivery. They had meals to go during COVID. Eventually, they now have 30 regular volunteers and about 60 occasional volunteers, helping these handful of congregants run the show. They have enough money for 1.5 staff people. They now serve meals 6 days a week, and currently have hired a new part-time pastor. This is a resurrection story. It needs to be told, and the stories of all these churches need to be told, not only to the diocese, but each other. And there needs to be a way that these organizations or churches can be in touch, tell about their successes, even their failures, but tell what works, and a means of supporting one another so that they can share this positivity that comes from outreach in the community. So that's about what I'd like to tell you today. We can tell you more in the report, but that's where it's at right now.
Doug, do you want me to say anything more about this? You kind of touch on these different issues from your thriving summary. That's my next page. Some of these sort of point to some of the recommendations that are going to be part of this thriving area. And I think you've sort of referenced a number of these. We keep coming back to this idea that perhaps a web page on the diocesan website that focuses on small and rural churches, where we could assemble resources, ideas, good suggestions, maybe have some kind of a blog or something, that would be something. We keep coming back to that as a way to one way to bring people together. And there are some others that will be contained in the report. Bishop, do you have any questions or anything you want to say at this point? I have got just like 2 more slides, I think.
Well, no, I'm just going to wait till you're done and then we can
Okay.
talk.
Aha, the summary. How about that? Because we do have some specific questions we'd like to ask you about going forward. And, we have a lot. St. George, of course, is as Doug said, that's a huge story and really a tremendous model for a lot of churches. But we've heard about a lot of smaller examples of resilience and endurance in some of these churches. Perhaps these churches, as well as people generally in the diocese, need to let go of some notions about small congregations as not being real church. Doug corrected my language. I said not church. He said, no, not real church. But that we need to really kind of let go of that, because these congregations are, they're dedicated. They care about their communities. They don't have a lot of resources sometimes, but they really are carrying on some important work. I was surprised at how many were open to alternative modes of leadership. I wasn't sure quite what to make of the LPLs before we started this task force. And as I visited congregations, I've been pleased to hear how proud congregations are of their LPLs and what they're doing. And as well as the lay leaders and the deacons. But, it's not like these folks feel like they're getting second best. In many instances, they feel like they have capable leaders and leaders in worship, and that's important. It isn't all rosy here. We do have some churches that are in trouble or sort of on the brink of closure and so forth. And so perhaps we need to be thinking about how to provide support, maybe an intervention sooner rather than later, not to wait till they totally fall apart, but to probably bring them into this discussion around small and rural churches and how they might thrive in their particular settings. So that's the end of my show. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. And a couple things. As we finish our report, we've been trying to think about ways in which we could share this report so that it does have some impact. Certainly, we want to share it with all the small congregations and the groups that we interviewed and talked with and so forth. They're interested in finding out what we came up with. But I guess we'd like to hear from you about how you think we might best share some of these findings. Who needs to hear this?
Everybody. Everybody needs to hear this.
Oh, Lucy, you're muted.
You're muted, Lucy. You're mute.
I said I asked Nancy to send me copies of these slides, which she did, because I think this is something the staff needs to see at a staff meeting.
Yeah.
And everybody else too, but at least that's one. And I also thought maybe, Mike does nothing like volunteering Mike when he's not here, but Mike does such a wonderful job with his little short films of the churches that he goes to talk to about, what their ministries are. It would be really interesting, I think, to see some of those films being done on sort of more non-traditional churches that we have, and the stories like the story Doug told about Leadville. Other churches have stories too. I think it would be great if we could do some of that.
Yeah, so that's my initial response, Nancy. Everybody needs to hear this, especially in terms, Doug, I love what you did with the term thriving. What does thriving ministry look like? And I think that, we have been living, at least for the last 40 years, that you had to have a certain number of people, you had to have money in the bank, all of these matrices that don't really apply to, church life as we've known it for the last 1,000 years, right? This is sort of a strange thing to impose. And the recognition that the gospel can flourish and ministry can thrive with a handful of dedicated people willing to do that work and be that presence in the community. That's a story that everybody needs to hear. In my conversations, as I've been talking to folks, what I've wanted to do, and I'm glad to hear this in that you've gotten in your conversations, is how do we equip and support our lay pastoral leaders? How do we more fully utilize the ministry of deacons in ways that are respectful to their order, how they are ordered? They are not priests. They are different. They have a different order of ministry. And how do we do that respectfully and make that part of our overall wellness as a diocese? I've been working with formation to figure out how do we, given our vast geographic challenge, how do we provide continuing education, formation, collaborative, collegiality for lay folks who are leaders in their community? And then what does the clergy support for that look like? Because you've heard me say it maybe a few times, but lay-led, clergy supported. What does the clergy support look like in places where there's vibrant ministry going on, but not the capacity to afford full-time clergy in that place? So those are some of the questions I've been asking, because I think the Episcopal voice in some of our smaller communities is so important. It is, when I go to see St. Luke's and Westcliff, their voice in that community is so important, because they are speaking to the needs of the community in ways that reflect how we understand a loving God through Christ. So that's important to me, and wanting to highlight those stories and then figure out how do we support that ministry. I think the challenge in a lot of cases, Doug, you said it, is that as congregations think about themselves, if they think about themselves in terms of their diminishment and what they don't have, they become very insular and very inward focused. And that is deadly to a congregation.
Yeah.
And so trying to figure out, how do we shift that model? How do we boost our partnerships so that they're not just marriages of convenience, but that they're actually like folks who care and want to support ministry in their area together, and are willing to figure out how to do that. Those are all the challenges. And I am encouraged that the folks on this task force are digging into that work to figure out how to do that. And I want to be in partnership with you to figure out how it works, because we know this is Colorado. There is no one size fits all. So figuring out what communities need and how we meet those needs, I think, is the next step. But I really think the big push is about formation and support of lay pastoral leaders, and some work in terms of how we raise up and deploy deacons as well.
I'm kind of concerned with the laity in general and the idea of individual ministries. I think there are people in every congregation that can do more, that may have thought about doing more, maybe that don't feel they're entirely equipped.
Mm-hmm.
I know in my case, when I first came to the church, I noticed how nice it was to have scripture read from by lay people on the altar.
Mm-hmm.
And I told myself, you could probably do that. And then I said, well, I don't have any experience being in front of people. And I can't remember exactly when I decided, but I said, I'm going to do that. And I'll work my way through it. And I did. And things have never been the same.
Well, and Doug, that's the other thing. As I've talked to lay pastoral leaders, I was talking to Mary up in Sterling, there is part of this that has to do with your calling, right? It has to do with the gifts that you have and how you're being called by God to use those in community. And I want to keep that part of this front and center, because I think it's not just about you can fog a mirror, you got to be a lay pastoral leader. No, it's got to be you have a heart and a commitment and a calling to do this ministry. And I think that's part of what I'd like to promote moving forward. And I think it is helpful, and this is what I've been doing with our deacons as I'm trying, that's one specific order, but to let folks see examples. So in our congregations that don't or have never had lay pastoral leaders, let them sort of see examples of what that's like, who does that ministry and how they do that. I would love for that to be a part of our work going forward, that exposure is a big piece of this. And I think not only exposure to the ministry of lay pastoral leaders, but exposure to the stories of small congregations, etc., I think is going to be important.
Yeah, I'm wondering too, it seems like the placement or the springing up of LPLs, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe limited to churches that are part of partnerships, churches that have at least a vicar. But I'm aware of congregations that have neither a priest nor a vicar.
One of the things that we talked about a little bit, and that I've talked to the bishop about, is finding people who can be coaches or supervisors or mentors for lay pastoral leaders who are in a situation where they have no partnership vicar or no real supervision. And that one of the wonders of Zoom is it doesn't have to be somebody who is right there. I mean, it would be nice if the person were right there, but if we can't find somebody right there, maybe we can find somebody, 50 miles away who can be that person's mentor. But there are ways of doing this that are creative that I don't think we have tapped yet, that we need to work on.
And some of that comes up in our recommendations, which, kind of run the gamut. We've got, I don't know how many total recommendations at this point, but, trying to identify who might assume some responsibility for some action step, as well as, what we need to find out who that person might be, who might be able to provide. For example, Lucy's, suggestion that sometimes a lay pastoral leader has been working with a priest, and then the priest retires, and then there's the LPL standing on their own. Well, who's supposed to pick up the pieces there and provide some guidance and support, be a backstop for those LPLs who are sort of on their own? So we try to talk about some of that in our report and so forth. So we feel like we've kind of reached a conclusion of what we kind of think of as phase 1. We don't know if there is a phase 2, but there might be some things, some areas that individuals want to keep pursuing. I think there's a lot of interest in trying to maybe investigate what other dioceses are doing, find out some of those good examples. I've done a little bit of that just on my own, and I find it intriguing to talk to folks in other dioceses and find out, oh, that's how you're dealing with that situation of potential closure of a congregation and how things can happen. Doug's got that interest in terms of lay people. What is needed to get people to feel prepared to step up and say, well, I can run a morning prayer service or whatever. That there might be a number of things that we're just not empowering or even suggesting, leading people to do. I think that's part of this. Yeah.
I heard a presentation online yesterday that was part of the Genesis project. That the presentation was by somebody who is on the staff at St. Paul's Cathedral in Boston, and she was listing practices that help churches thrive. And one of the things was similar to Doug's concern about lay people not picking up or not getting involved in ministries. And the advice she gave at that point was invent ministries around people's gifts. And she gave as an example a homeless guy who comes to church every Sunday at St. Paul's and who loves baptism. And he sits in the front row for every baptism because he feels so strongly about it. He remembers his own baptism. He was not a baby when he was baptized. And he became the water bearer for baptisms. They created a ministry for him that allowed him to do this. And that was very moving to me because I think if we keep our eyes and ears open, there's ways we can do that with people that will allow more and more people to be committed to some ministry in the church.
And I am president of Providence 6, which is, where we are, and we are all churches with pretty big geographic territory and as dioceses. But we've been in conversation, and I would like to continue. I know there's been some people involved in conversations around the small and rural church. Ellen Bruckner has been leading those conversations. And I agree with you, Nancy. I think we can learn from one another. We can learn from what works and what doesn't work. And, it doesn't mean that everything will be applicable, but, I always say we can always Mike Dyson it, right? We can take the idea and figure out how to make it work in our context, if it's viable. And I think, one of the things that I say to my staff is when I was serving in a parish in DC, we had a ministry for our homeless and hungry neighbors. And I said, we're going to stop calling our church people volunteers. They are ministers. People in the church are ministers, and we're asking them to share their gifts of ministry with folks, and we're calling them into that. And so I think so much of how we understand ourselves is how we talk about what it is we're called to do.
I have one question, and maybe this is just a big question to ponder into the future, but I think about our deacons that are interested in doing more and stepping up and taking on some different roles. I think of lay people that are doing lots of wonderful things in different places. How ready are our priests in our diocese? How open are they to really, not just think about, this is my job, this is what I do, and this is what my world looks like, but to think about how prepared are they to really do this work of encouraging lay leadership in their congregations beyond just, we need a vestry, we need a senior ward, and I have no feel for that question. I just sort of wonder about it. And I'm sure there are good examples and bad examples.
It's tough. I mean, I get a lot of pushback when I say lay led and clergy supported. I get a lot of pushback from priests mostly. And that's going to be kind of the piece. And for that's going to be the sticky wicket, I think, because for me, it's very clear to make sure that our orders are distinct and to see those places where the priests have assumed too much, right? There's that as well. And so that's the difficult piece that we're kind of trying to parse out, and how do we talk about those things in ways that are faithful. But it is really so much more, and I don't mean to be crude by this, but ministry has to be more than magic hands. And so, and that's the tough part. I mean, that's for me, the kind of big stumbling block that we have to get over. We have to get over.
Right. And I'm not sure we've totally tackled that in our research and work, focusing specifically on priests. We've talked about clergy utilization, but that'll be a challenge because it's an adjustment for everyone. And certainly those who are so committed to the church, their vocation is in serving the church as ordained persons. But can they see these opportunities in different places and be supportive, not just turn aside from that opportunity? I don't know. I'm not sure where I'm going with that question, but I just sort of popped up as we discussed it. Well, I think
I
that's
think,
sort of,
Nancy,
go ahead.
to me, that has to do with change and just how willing people are to accept the changing nature of the church. And, there are those who are going to embrace it and those who feel threatened by it and those who say absolutely not. And it's going to be, it's going to be an ever evolving challenge.
Yeah, and I get all sorts of stuff like deacons gone wild. I'm like, really? I don't have enough deacons to go wild. I mean, it's really funny. Like, somebody said, well, you might have a rogue deacon. I'm like, what is that in your mind? What does that even look like? But, I think Lucy's right. It is about change and about sort of figuring out how we navigate this new church landscape. Because we recognize that some of our expectations about what makes church are not sustainable. They're not sustainable. And they're not necessarily, I love what you said, Doug. It doesn't mean that somehow church is less real because we can't sustain this specific model. I think in a lot of ways, church is more real because it is about the body of Christ doing the work of Christ in the world.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't real for the first 1,000 years. I mean,
Exactly.
it wouldn't be here if it wasn't.
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's true. Well, that's the end of our presentation, but we will be working hard to finish up this report. I think we're looking at trying to tidy this up and have it in some kind of deliverable form by the first part of the year. Maybe it's almost Thanksgiving. I don't know how this is all going to happen, but we'll have a draft. I want to get input from people. I think that's important as well, if people are willing to do that. But we've got a good start. I mean, a really good base right now with the reports we've done so far in our several subgroups. So we'll have that ready to push forward, and we'll be talking with people like Mike at some point to get his input on how he thinks we could roll this out. I mean, maybe he's the person because it's communication and finding some different ways, different avenues to do that. So that sounds great. Well, Bishop Kim, we really appreciate your time this morning.
I want you to hear how grateful I am for your faithfulness in this work. I know this was a pretty big task, and I'm really impressed with the work that you've done and the conversation you've had, and want to figure out how we take this and build on it. I don't want it to be, again, something that goes on the shelf, but
Yeah.
something that we really engage for the life of our church.
Right. Doug, you have any final word to say here?
I don't know if it's a final word, but one thing I didn't mention was that in small communities, there are other churches that are in the same boat as our Episcopal churches, and I've seen and heard enough about cooperation and collaboration among those small churches that I really believe strongly in it, and I think more of it can happen, perhaps with some influence from the diocese. From what did you call those people, Nancy? I've forgotten the term now.
The different adjudicatory heads that we
Yes, exactly.
Right. Which is what Bishop Kim's been working with Bishop Gonya from the Lutherans. I mean, that's been a very fruitful sort of connection. So wherever we can do it, whatever our opportunities are to keep pushing that, pushing that agenda, I think that's important too. There are often resistance at the local level, but there might be good intentions at that judicatory level to work together. So somehow that's got to filter down into the local setting as well.
And that's true. I mean, really, it is a little harder with churches that we are not in full communion with, like with the Methodists, but Buena Vista is making it work, and I'm really excited about that. But with the Lutherans, Bishop Gonya and I are in conversation about partnership. How do we share clergy? How do we share? And I know in some places they were like, well, if it's the Lutherans call them pastors, are they really doing priestly ministry? And the answer is yes. Yes, they are, because that's just the difference in title. They're what they do in terms of the sacramental presence is the same. And we have been trying to work with that to see in what places can we share ministry, and what does that look like for the life of the church.
Great. Well, I think I successfully recorded this, so I can share this with the rest of the members of the task force. But Bishop Kim, we appreciate your interest and encouragement. And Ken and Lucy, you've been a terrific person to take seriously the issues that came up and to see, well, what could be done about some of those, and I think that's been great.
Well, thank you, but we're not done yet.
I know we're not there yet, but we're at a good place, I think, in terms of our understanding. And that was something we didn't have when we started out. So I think that's a good thing.
Right.
Okay,
Thank you all.
You both.
All right.
thank
Well,
you.
take care. Thank you, Bishop. And you'll be hearing from us, I'm sure.
Okay.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.